I'm going to explain how anthropology is vital to experiencing the myriad dimensions of God and how his kingdom manifests itself through cultural forms, each of which can capture an angle of his essence that the other cannot. Just as it takes a community of individuals to understand the various aspects of a single individual's personality, it takes a community of diverse cultures to understand the various aspects of God's personality. Let me create a backdrop. Culture seems to create interpretations of the phenomena the mind collects, yet this is where it ends. There's no real facts. Like David Hume once remarked, the wise man proportions his belief to the evidence. And as it turns out, the evidence isn't substantial enough to make a verdict. Culture seemingly creates the world as we see it, but the real world, whatever that is, can never be intellectually apprehended. Moreover, when one does claim knowledge of the real world, it's an epistemological disaster, attempting to find pockets of rationality in an infinitely irrational universe. So, how can one step foot on solid epistemological ground? Well, let Paul answer. In Romans, he begins and ends his letter with his mission to bring individuals to the obedience of faith. Well, what is this faith? I believe it is rightfully putting God at the beginning. It's a starting point for rationality, meaning, and understanding. Consider the law without presupposing God is nonsensical, yet rationality without presupposing God is doubly absurd. A testament to man's arrogance is to apprehend the universe intellectually with himself as the starting point. Therefore, the limitations and irrational concept of culture as the starter now has a hint of rationality because it's not the starting point, God is. Hence, when God becomes the starter, the mind is renewed, the external is transformed, and the universe becomes discernible. Well, Chester and Timmis rightly declare that all theology, or discourse about God, proceeds on the basis that God has revealed himself. The initiative is his alone. Our knowledge of God is dependent upon his own self disclosure. So theology is not philosophy. It's neither speculative in nature nor esoteric in content. All theology must be the fruit of serious engagement with the Bible. Theology, properly understood, is an encounter with the living God in his word. Furthermore, God's disclosure in Christ the Word and the Word of the Bible is that which scrutinizes us. As we examine the light exposes our flaws and reveals an alternative, authentic reality. It's the key word, authentic reality. It is in learning about God that we come to know ourselves. So only in the light of God can man be understood. Thus, a rational anthropology assumes God. Cannot chalk up God as a cultural construct, for it have no rational basis for doing so. Therefore, we have anthropology, the study of man, culture, society, etc. Yet the cultures of man are manifold and vastly different. See, the substance of culture is spiritual or supracultural. Yet the form of the culture is an expression of the spiritual, and there are many. By definition, the absolute is that which is underived and unchanging. These are the words of Barney. Conversely, the relative is derived, dependent, and changing. God is absolute, underived, and unchanging. But consider the following implication: the gospel is given of God, therefore it's derived. Cannot be absolute. Is it therefore relative? If so, it is changeable. Yet Paul in Galatians speaks of one gospel. Another conceptual category is needed between absolute and relative. It would seem the term constant might meet this need. Constant refers to that which by nature does not change, though it may be derived. It's helpful to add constant between absolute and relative as conceptual categories in our consideration of the supracultural and the cultural. Then it follows that God is absolute. That which he initiates and affirms to humanity in his covenant and redeeming acts is constant. However, the forms in which people respond God to God, express their faith, and live out their relationship with God are tied to their culture and therefore are relative. The absolute and the constant are supercultural, but the response of the people is relative and varies from culture to culture as each society expresses the supracultural in forms peculiar to its own cultural configuration. Thus, a relevant expression of God human relationship preserve the integrity, unique identity of a culture, but in no way needs to compromise um, the essence of the supracultural. So therefore, the Christian anthropologist has an exciting venture in front of him. Rather than ethnocentrically cling to the superiority of his form, he gets to study how the myriad forms that the universals, the substance of faith, express themselves. Truly, there could be a practically infinite number of forms. If the missionary is to be successful, not seemingly successful, but measured success, he needs to have a firm comprehension of the forms. Oddly enough, we arrive in an archaeology of God, the adventure of discovering artifacts, cultural forms that symbolize him. However, as Timothy Chester noted, the supracultural needs to be understood in order for the cultural to be understood. All right, so we go back to the pockets of rationality, or we need to presuppose God in order to have a rational understanding of man. All right, so more, if the missionary seeks to create rationality for the group they are evangelizing, they need to use the form that is already understood. For example, if I was trying to quench someone's thirst, I would fill the glass they have readily available. I wouldn't pour the water in a glass in another country. This wouldn't benefit them. The analogy is relatively poor. However, if I seek to reach certain individuals, I must use what is familiar to them, or they're forever out of my reach. When Jesus taught the fishermen, he used analogies of fish. When he taught to shepherds, he used analogy of sheep. All right, people learn. All right, you can reach people, communicate to people by what's familiar to them. Communication, for instance, has certain universals, nonverbal. However, if I wish to truly communicate, I need to apprehend the linguistics of the culture I find myself. The divine linguistics, the universals, are similar to nonverbals. However, if I wish to communicate in fellowship with the church in every culture, I need to speak the specific language of God, that culture. Therefore, missions is just revelation meeting the proper cultural form disposed to decoding that revelation. This in turn will ensure a response and a greater understanding of the immensity